So hopefully you got some food and a beverage of your liking. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce Izzy and tonight's topic. So we start off by talking about any other local meetups, I think, right? We do that? That are going on. So does anybody know of any other meetups that are happening soon or that they would like to advertise here to this group?
Yeah, we have that.
You gotta do it.
Hi, everyone. If I didn't get to meet you, I'm Leslie Peterson. I'm with Engage, and I help organize this event with these fine fellows, John and Robert, Simon and Bill Hoffman with Engage. So,
You have to pay her to say fine fellows work.
I like the alliterations. We also like to host two other meetups in town. One of them is C3, Code Crafting Community, and it's a great opportunity for more senior devs to be paired with younger devs and work on a real life project. We host that in Engage Partners, which is down on Riverside outside of downtown. So look for that on LinkedIn. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me and I can get you to the page. It's on meetup.com. We are moving, yeah. For anybody who doesn't know, we are moving from our building. We're going to be in Lake Park. I think that's what it is. It's in Blue Ash. We're going to be Blue Ash across from Summit Park. So it'll be more centrally located, and we can host meetups there, as well as like we did at the old one. I know. Boom, yay! I'm Yeah, I know. Anyway. So that's a great meetup. We also have, it's a remote meetup, and it is QA, I'm blanking on the name. It's a QA meetup, so if you know maybe who's interested. Ministry of Testing, thank you. That's online, I'm not sure what page it is, but it's once a month online. Yeah, and Engage, for anybody who doesn't know, we are a purpose-driven technology consulting company, so we can put together a full projects team or help you on a project that you're working on and help supplement the resources. We're very much into giving back to the community. We're a certified B Corp, which means we have a triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit, and we take it very seriously with that certification. We're also 100% employee-owned, so it's really cool.
Awesome, and just so everyone knows, we say this every time, but there could be new people. The only reason why this works is because of this lady right here. It's true. Okay. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Izzy Eichen. She is going to give us a talk on writing quality OpenAPI spec.
Yep. So we want to call the same thing. So it's an OpenAPI contract, not a spec throughout this talk, right? It's kind of important when you're writing documentation is making sure you call the same thing. And if you can tackle heckler, absolutely you should do that. So like John said, I am Izzy. I'm here to talk to you all about writing a quality OpenAPI contract. And one of the unique qualifications that I have to give you all this topic is that I, in my career, have looked at hundreds of OpenAPI contracts. That's not too big of an exaggeration. At my last job at Kroger, I was partially responsible for maintaining or helping teams display and control their OpenAPI documents. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of OpenAPI contracts. So I think that OpenAPI itself is kind of like its own little language. And it's not given the credit that it deserves of how complicated it actually is. A lot of people are just like, oh, it's YAML, it's just JSON, I'll figure it out, it'll be fine. But I think there's a lot of knowledge that I have from my past experience that uniquely qualify me for giving this talk and helping people learn how to write really quality OpenAPI contracts. Because they're so important, guys. You don't even know. So there are a couple of assumptions that we're making as we give this talk, so let's make sure we're going to go over them real quick. One, I'm hopeful you all are at least a little bit familiar with what a REST protocol is. The API contract that we're going to use as an example is a RESTful API. And I think I talk about get, post, patch, and delete endpoints. So hopefully that's not something that's brand new to all of you. Hopefully you all have at least seen some YAML before. YAML is just the documentation structure. It's a key value pair. If you haven't seen it before, it is pretty easy to pick up. But the examples that I'm going to give you are in YAML, so hopefully you've at least seen it before. Hopefully you've heard of an API contract as a concept. I don't expect anybody else to really be experts in API contracts. That's what I'm here to help you learn how to do. But hopefully you've at least heard of the concept of an API contract. Maybe you've heard of it as Swagger. That's a former name of OpenAPI. But maybe you've heard of it. Hopefully you have. We'll talk a lot more about it throughout the rest of this talk. There's a couple inside jokes that I make in this talk, and it's a lot easier if everybody understands what they are at the front. One is that it's really funny to talk about backpacks and soap. If any of you have ever met someone named Mark Steiber, who understand a lot more about this, just understand that I wrote this talk thinking about that, and there were a lot of times when I was writing this talk where I started laughing out loud in my house by myself, and my dog thought I was insane. And the other thing you need to know is Robert Buchanan's real name is Bobbert, and I am not going to let anybody else tell me anything different. So if you do work with Bobbert or see him in real life, please spread this rumor as much as possible and try to convince other people his real name is Bobbert. That inside joke really only works for this room when he's in here. So, but I'm really proud of this joke that I literally figured out how to make an hour ago. Okay. So we're also going to cover a couple things of this talk is actually not about related to APIs. We're not going to talk about API architecture. I'm not going to talk about whether or not you should have data services or microservices or monolithic services or how to fully design your API or how to write your API. A lot of that is going to be based off of your company standards along with the security that you need to put in place for your API. That's a lot of security or company standards, company directed. I'm not here to talk to you about that. I'm here, you have an API architecture, you have an API design. We need to document it so we can communicate our API out. So that's the main thing about this talk. We're also not talking about agentic frameworks and how APIs, OpenAPI contracts can work with agentic frameworks. If you're really curious about that, you can ask Heckler to ask ChatGPT, and he'll give you the question he asked, he'll give you ChatGPT's response. If you don't care about it, like I did when he did this to me, you can say, you're not the boss anymore, and you don't need to care about what he said. Remember what I said at the start? If you can heckle Heckler, you should heckle Heckler. I'm funny. All right, but let's get into it. So what really is an API contract? Why do you need one? The API contract communicates information about how your API works. Right? It is a specific format of YAML or JSON. Like I said, we're going to use YAML in this talk. It's written by the consumer, or the producer, so the owners of the API, the people who write and maintain the actual code behind the API. And it's given to the consumers who are using the API so that the consumers can figure out how to use your API. It is, I had a phrase for this and totally just blanked out of my head. Give me a second. It tells the consumers what the producer is expecting, and then given that the consumer can give the API what is expected, it tells you also what you can receive from the API given that you followed the contract. It's not like a contract between two people that you're signing and all of your lawyers are involved. It's between your producers and your consumers telling you how to call the API and what will be returned from the API, assuming you're calling it correctly. The definition of OpenAPI and API contract is owned by, I think it's at least maintained by SmartBear. It used to be called Swagger. If you're still using Swagger, that's so 2018. Get with the times. And it's now known as OpenAPI. It is pretty vast. There's a couple, I have links in here for a couple different ways you can look at your OpenAPI specification and the definition behind it. There's one that's a little bit more UI friendly. It has a lot of different sub-bullet points, but the pages are a lot smaller, so I find this one to be a little bit more consumable. And there's also a version that exists in GitHub, which is the entire thing all in one document. And as you can see, as I'm scrolling through this and not stopping at anything, it is what you can do with OpenAPI documents is actually large and vast, and it's a lot, right? There's so much that you can do with OpenAPIs that we're not even going to talk about 90% of what you can do. Because what we really want to get is a good foundation and understanding the few basics that you can have that you really truly need to communicate your API contracts out to your consumers, so that once you can build on once you understand the foundation, once you understand how to do this properly, you can then start looking into more of the details of what you can actually do with OpenAPI. But before you go too big, let's make sure we understand the foundation first and get really good at a little bit of it before we try to do everything. That's how I like to live my life. Get really good at like a little bit and then expand from there. So what else? Well, first thing we're going to talk about is our basic OpenAPI structure. This is the foundational bit that you should really get good at, really understand before you start expanding too much. So the first thing you have is your metadata section. So these are typically kind of like near the top of your OpenAPI contract. You have an OpenAPI field, which kind of just declares the version of the OpenAPI specification you're going to use to write the contract. You have your info block, which has like the title of your API, descriptions, terms of service, contact information, which is actually really, really important because sometimes consumers get confused and they actually need to reach out to you, but like we're trying to prevent that by having a good OpenAPI contract. External docs, so if you have any additional information, any like Confluence links, Wikipedia pages, industry standard pages that are needed for to help understand your contract and how it works, that's where those go, it's great. Your servers, which is your target host, and you usually combine your target host with the path, the route for the full and then with the path in your API document, which we'll talk about in a second, and that will be like the full URL of your API and what all the consumers really need to call your entire API. And then you have tags, which are just really useful to like group information together. We'll go over this a little bit more in depth in a few slides, but like that's where we're at. With OpenAPI contracts, there are so many different versions associated in so little time. And understanding the difference between these three versions is something that I've found is very confusing and a lot more complicated than it seems at first. So there's three different versions that we're talking about when we're talking about OpenAPI specifications or APIs in general. One is our OpenAPI version, like I said, so like that's that first little bit at the top where it's like, in this example, it's OpenAPI 3.0.4. It's communicating the version of the OpenAPI specification that you use to write your API contract. It's gonna be standard, probably, that's not gonna change too much. You're probably gonna pick one when you start and you're probably gonna stick with it unless they make another major upgrade like they did when they went from Swagger to OpenAPI. The second one is your info.version. This refers to the version of the contract document itself. It is usually completely unrelated from the version of the API that is actually released out that consumers are using. Because your document changes are often separate from where your code changes. And your info.version is going to change when you update your document, not necessarily when you update your code. Sometimes they are the same, but largely they are different. Because you have our last version is our API version. So that's the version of the code that is released for the users to use. This is updated when your code changes. Sometimes, like the ideal situation is that you are perfect at your API contracts, so you are only really updating them if your API is changing. And also in this perfect world, you don't ever really release silly little bugs that you have to go in and fix that don't require contract changes. So like if we're perfect developers, which obviously we all are, right? They're the same. But unfortunately, humans do tend to make mistakes. So we'll have different info.versions and different API versions. So like an example of an info.version changing and an API contract version not changing is if I'm looking at my OpenAPI spec and I notice I have a bunch of typos everywhere, I've spelled something wrong somewhere and I need to go back and fix it, I'm gonna change my info.version, but guess what? That's spelled right in my code. I don't need to change my code, so my API version stays the same. It's really, like, I've met a lot of developers that have a lot of difficulty understanding the concept of these version numbers being different. And I see a lot of developers saying like, oh, anytime I release a new version of my API, I'm gonna release a new version of my spec, even if I'm just fixing a bug in the back end and nothing in my contract has actually changed. You don't really wanna do that. I've also seen developers just completely ignore the info.dot version and just be like, here you go, here's this contract, it's this thing. You can't ever really tell how I changed it from version to version. I mean, if you need to, I guess you can go in my Git history and find out how my file changed, but like, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. We don't want to be those people. Okay. I mean, Heckler might be those people, but the rest of us don't want to be like Heckler. Alright, the next big section, this is like the nuts and bolts of your API, is your paths. These are the routes in the API, the actions that you can take on the routes, what kind of parameters you need for them, what kind of headers you can have for them, what kind of request bodies you need for some of your requests, how to perform these actions, and then what is the expected response from the action. So you'll see, like, you'll have your, I know this is kind of small and hard to read, and I'm really sorry, I'll expand. Actually, let's just go over here. So this is a Swagger editor. It is a very useful tool. I meant to describe it at the start of my talk, but I totally forgot, so we're gonna describe it now. You have a UI view of your API over here on the right, and you have an editor version where you can edit your API documents on the left. It's actually pretty cool, because if you are writing your document and let's say you make an error, like you have a typo somewhere in your references, it actually will tell you if you are like breaking the OpenAPI spec and you have errors related to the OpenAPI spec. Cool. So paths, right? So these are your paths: the get, post, the get, this patch, this delete. These are your paths. You can define your parameters. So what can I send in as like query parameters, path parameters, header parameters, what all that nonsense is. Anything you need to call, anything that you can or need to use to call this path or this route to perform this HTTP action, that's going to be up here. And then what is my expected response back? Right, so here you called me with this information that I have told you to call me with, and I will give you this back. Okay? That's paths in a nutshell. And then the final block, which is probably the most complicated block of your OpenAPI code, is your components at the bottom. This is the #1 block of the OpenAPI contract that actually like trips people up and is where a lot of the mistakes I've seen in OpenAPI contracts live. Components are reusable blocks of information that can be referenced throughout the contract. In the components, you can have headers, parameters, schemas, request bodies, responses, security schemes, and examples. That's a lot, and it's a lot of places that you can get really messed up and tripped up. When you're starting your OpenAPI journey, I highly recommend just getting components down to like 1 or 2 of these bullets. I would recommend starting with schemas and security schemes to help document those. I think they're the most useful pieces that you can have in your components. And get really good at understanding how the document references work, referencing down into your component structure. Once you've mastered one of these types, then start spreading out into more, but like pick one to start with, right? Master that foundation before you move on to trying to do more than what you really need to do. Components are they're reusable documents. You call them by saying, hey, you use this key phrase like $ref to reference. I'm going to let your API spec know you're going to reference some other spot in your document, and then you call it with the path to get to that. So this is component schemas, and I'm looking at that kind of schema. I should explain the API example that I'm using. I will in a second. So if I put in an object that doesn't exist, which is what I did earlier, I'll see an error at the top like, hey, this is not, I see you. Hey, this is not where this thing you're trying to go to doesn't exist. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is everything typically in one big text file?
Yes. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. You should expect your API contracts to be a large text file. It sucks, it's tedious, it's often difficult to maintain, but the benefit that you get from having it be a large text file far outweighs trying to be much smaller and like dry. Okay. and I definitely have a whole section on that in a little bit. So this is the example API that I created for this talk. It is a backpacks API. Remember, backpacks are funny, especially if they're together. Remember that. You can learn more about SOAP by clicking this link for this external document. This is really funny. It's looking like server. I laughed for a solid 10 minutes in my house when I made this, when I decided to put this in my document. So just, can I get like a pity chuckle like that? Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, you can elaborate on the Mark Cyber reference.
I'll do that at the end. Okay. I didn't even bring that backpack with me. So you can get backpacks, like my fake example, right? We have a store. You can get backpacks. You can have items inside of your backpacks. A backpack can have an ID, a name, and it has an array of items inside of it. Our items have an ID and a quantity. And then items also live kind of separately. So an item itself has an ID, a name, and a weight to it. This is my fake example I created. This API doesn't actually exist. I just thought like a backpack that contains items was a pretty simple and easy example that I could write like an API for, so I'm not like trying to teach you a whole like thing while I'm also trying to teach you how to write an OpenAPI. It's fine. For backpacks and items, I can just retrieve all of them, retrieve the specific one, I can create them, I can update them, or I can delete them. That's kind of where we're at. Let me know at the end if that's enough information to get us through the rest of this talk, because it's the first time I'm giving this talk, so I'd definitely like some feedback on this. But this is the example that we'll use a lot. Cool. So we're going to start with me giving you all some piece of advice for things that I think about when I'm writing these OpenAPI documents. The number one piece of advice is don't be a punk and skip out on your descriptions and examples. Descriptions and examples, having meaningful, well-written and meaningful descriptions and examples is the number one thing you can add to your API contracts. Because it's going to go a long way to tell your consumers what to really expect. So if I am in my, this is kind of meh. I had to rush through a little bit of creating my document. But a good spot where I have some more details. Okay. So I could say, retrieve all of the backpacks in the store and get example. But I don't really tell you anything related to these items because all I'm doing is sending you an item ID. So something that I could do better is kind of increase this description here, saying hey, if you need information about the specific items inside of the backpack, you can use the items ID to call to get items in point and get the more specific information about your item ID or your item based off of its ID. Here is the information that I'm giving you. Here's how to use the information that I'm giving you. Making sure your descriptions and examples are correct is the number one thing. If you learned anything from this talk, please let it be that. Making sure hey, can I send multiple IDs in an ID? If I am, it should be something here's how you send multiple IDs. It should be a comma separated list. My example, I took care to make sure that anytime I'm referring to a backpack ID, I have the same UUID to use that you're using. So you can see oh, okay, I have this response, here's an ID, okay, well where does this ID exist? Oh, here's where this ID exists, so that must be a good spot where I can put any sort of ID that I would get back from an array. As developers, we tend to like patterns and examples and things to follow. So the more you can maintain the patterns and examples in your code and your contract, the easier it's going to be for the consumers to learn how to use your APIs. Okay. So number one, don't be a punk, don't skip out on your descriptions, and don't skip out on your examples. All three of those together, well, the descriptions and examples together, it's two things. I know how to count. Really, really take an OpenAPI document from an okay OpenAPI document to a good OpenAPI document. The other thing is common phrases that I say to myself when I'm working on API contracts. The first one is, well, it's not wrong, but it's not right, or it's not good, or it's not really correct. But you're not wrong, right? So A good example I have for this is if we have, let's say I am a lazy dev, because all good devs are lazy devs. And I just decided that instead of writing UUIs, instead of doing all of this nonsense every single time I needed to write a UUID in my contract, I just want to have a component object in my schemas that's UUID, and anytime I need a UUID, I'm just going to reference my component object. Okay, so that's all right. Like anytime I need a UUID, I don't just type like what 4 lines of code, like 4 lines of YAML, right? I can make my document a little bit smaller if I do that. But then I've lost the patterns that I've created, right? I'm not wrong, right? A UUID is a UUID. That's how you format a UUID. It's going to be the right format. My description is that, hey, it's a unique identifier. Saying something is a unique identifier isn't wrong, right? But how much does this really tell me about my UUIDs that are in the code? Does this tell me that like my item IDs and my backpack IDs actually referred as 2 separate objects? Not really. Am I able to see the pattern of like where these IDs are used, or do I just think everything has the same ID? Am I going to get really confused when I get those responses back and all the IDs are different, and I don't even know what to do with my life anymore because nothing matches how this contract is written, right? So it's not wrong, but it's not necessarily correct, right? And you want to strive for correctness. Flip side of that, the inverse that I think about is like, hey, that's not how the code works, but it communicates what we need to communicate to the consumer, right? So these 2 statements, if you just think about them back to back, they're a little contradictory, right? But there is a balance between them, and the winning thing that needs to be the communication behind what you're trying to do. So the second one's a little bit trickier to explain. So I've got another example. Let's say that for my backpack, I want to put a category in my backpack. So I know like what this backpack is being used for. Okay, cool. So I'm putting a category on a backpack. A category can be one of 4 things. It can be a diaper bag, it can be a work bag, it can be a school bag, or it can be a soap bag. Remember backpack? Right. There's one way I can communicate that, and that is through the description of the category. I can write my description that says, hey, this indicates the intended use of the category, indicates the intended use of the backpack. It must be one of the following. It must be diaper, school, work, or soap. If you don't send me in those values, I'm going to reject your request, and we're going to have to like go back and forth. You're actually, as a developer, going to have to read a description, which is like read the documentation, which right. The other thing I can do to communicate that this category can be one of 4 things is define category as an enum in my contract, which I have over here. So here I can see it's a little, it calls it out just a little, like having category being defined as an enum in my contract calls it out just a little bit more sharply that there really is only one of 4 correct values that I can have for my diaper, for my category of my backpack. But this having, oh God, words again, what is with words? Having my contract state that category is an enum doesn't necessarily mean that I need to have an enum category in my code. It's just a very quick and simple, easy way to communicate to users that there are only 4 appropriate values for this category. Yes?
Here you have enum options defined, which is kind of messy within category. Can you kind of make them like a reusable thing higher up?
Yeah, so by having it here as like, so this, okay, so what this object is, this is in my component schemas. This actually is the reusable thing. So when I am referring to my categories in my backpack object, I'm just referencing the thing. So it's a little bit more reusable.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you for having me call that out. Gary?
If you define something as an enum, if you add, say, this is another value, like a fifth value, you can instead of break and change?
I don't, because the enum is not in my code, because I don't want enums in my code, because adding to enums is a break and change to my code. Alright, but I wouldn't necessarily consider adding an enum to my documentation, adding another value to my documentation, a breaking change, maybe a major change, but probably, or maybe a minor change, but probably not a breaking change. It also depends on how close I am with my consumers and how I'm communicating to them. If I really need them to pay attention to the fact that there's a new value, or if the new value is just like a feature we're slowly starting to add, and like I just want them to be aware that like, hey, this is the thing that happens.
If you know, you know.
Yeah, if you know kind of thing, versus a hey everybody, like know this thing, right? That's what I like to use the major versions for. It's like, hey everybody, for contracts, it's like, hey everybody, know this thing that I'm doing, it's really cool, I want you all to pay attention to me. Everything else is usually just like a minor fix version. But yeah, like that's the main reason. That's a good point, right? I don't want to maintain enums in my code because adding change to an enum is a break and change to my code. I don't want to break my actual API, but I want to be able to use the very distinct list of things that can be the thing, and I want to make that very distinct list of things there. So when you're thinking about these two questions, it's a good idea to put your thumbs cap on and pretend that you don't know. For those of you who can't read, this is Robert. Remember at the beginning, Robert's name is Robert. It's funny. Pretend that you don't know anything about how your API works and read your API contract with those eyes. That's really going to help you figure out if your descriptions are meaningful, if your examples are well written, right? And if you are in one of these two categories of, well, it's not wrong, or I mean, that's not how the code works, but it's communicating effectively, right? So I was really proud when I figured out this joke like 2 minutes before I left my house. Just need you all to know that. Right. So now that we've gotten my amazing pieces of advice, let's talk about some common pitfalls that I've seen when I've looked through these hundreds of API documents that I've seen in my career. So we talked about great lazy devs. Good dev is lazy dev. Lazy devs sitting at their desk, they've got their API, they need a contract for their API, and they think to themselves, I know, I will have my code generate my API contract for me. Don't make me hurt you. Listen, if we're in a bind, if we really need, if our API is written and we haven't even touched an API contract, if you want to generate your OpenAPI file from your code, it's a jumping off point. It is not going to be the final version of your OpenAPI contract. The majority of the OpenAPI contracts that I have seen that have had problems were fully generated from the code itself. And that, like, it just makes me sad, right? That's why I wrote this whole talk, so you guys can all figure out how to manually intervene when you have your generated OpenAPI files. Your descriptions, they're not going to be great. Your examples, they're not going to be great. Your info object at the top with your contact information, not going to be great. Your references, probably terrible. Let's see, what else? Oh, one of the things that I've seen a lot with people who generate their OpenAPI from their code is you end up with objects that like don't have object definitions. And it's gonna take me a second to remember where I put this. So you'll be like, this is really common, I think, too, with like JavaScript. Like APIs that are generated like JavaScript, because JS is kind of like all loosey-goosey with whatever your objects can be, and you're just like, hey, I grew up on like strictly typed languages, so like all your loosey typed languages are, I don't understand them. Yeah, so here, like, you can have items, but that's not really telling you what an items array is actually, what the items object actually looks like, because if I look at if I look at my definition of my component, yep, I just see that items is defined as an object, and I don't really know what that is. It doesn't have any properties underneath of it, and I can't tell you what is exactly in an item because my code didn't know what was in an item. And so like that's one of the number one things that I see first in the common, the open API documents that are generated from your code. And things like this are really tricky to find because, as you can see, there's no errors. It's not telling me anything wrong is wrong with my document, right? I have a correct open API structure in my document, but it's just not there, right? So those are something that like you really need to, if you choose to be my enemy and generate your open API contract from your code, you really need to look through what it's doing with a fine-tooth comb, because there's going to be small things like this that are not going to jump out at the first glance. You really, really need to put your dunce cap on again, look at it with fresh eyes and say, I am someone who doesn't know how to use this API. What is this contract actually telling me how to do? Don't be a punk. That's a good advice. Going back to your question from earlier, like one of the other common pitfalls that I see is trying to have that dry contract, right? As developers, one of the first things we're taught once we learn how to write hello world is code should be reusable. We should have, if we're using code in more than one spot, then we should make sure we can refactor that so that code only exists in one spot. So if we have to change it later, we can change it later. I'm sorry, but in this world, you're going to need to go against your instincts. Your contract is going to be long, it's going to be tedious. I've seen OpenAPI contracts be upwards of 3,000 lines of YAML. They suck. I'm sorry, it's a slog to get through, but really it's for the best. Because if you're in situations where like anything and any definition of anything should be different to help communicate different things, you need to have that new definition. You need to define that separately, because it's going to make your consumers have an easier time understanding your contract. So like the UUID example from earlier is a good example. Saying something is a unique identifier every single time I have a UUID isn't telling you much about what that UUID is meant to do or how you're meant to use that UUID. But going back, to like our first example that we had, where we actually had a good kind of document. Where are all the button clicks? As you can tell, I've practiced with it a lot, right? And we're seeing descriptions and we're seeing IDs have more information related to them other than just like, hey, I'm a unique identifier. You're communicating a lot more. Remember, don't be a punk.
Question.
Yes.
Regarding UUIDs, is there any, as part of OpenAPI, is there any special mechanisms to define kind of like what is the namespace for a UUID that's being provided, or is that just going to be based on the description that you provide and just say, hey, this is...
Yeah, so a lot of it, there's two things. One is your description, which is going to tell you kind of like how to use the UUID. The other thing is like related to strings. Anything that has a type of string has a format, or can have a format. Format can be whatever you want it to be. UUID is a common one, date time is another common one. If you have, but like format is pretty free form, so like if you have a very specific formatted string that you need for whatever domain that you exist in, you can have format be whatever. So it's a combination of here's my description, here's how I use my ID, versus, and the type is my string, and my string is the format of this specific thing. I should really talk a lot more about formats and things like that when I rewrite this talk. I'm really glad you all are my guinea pigs. Thank you so much for being my guinea pigs, because I'm learning a lot about things that I need to add to this talk. All right. Okay. Then there's the last thing we'll go over is a lot of pretend useful features that OpenAPI has. A lot of these things can be great when used well, but I've seen them be really difficult to understand, so that people, when they use them, don't fully understand what exactly they're communicating to their users. The first one, we talked about it a little bit, is the references, right? We can either overuse a reference or underuse or it's not really underusing a reference. We can overuse a reference. We can have references to nothing. The other thing that I've seen is recursive references, which is super fun. Let me remember where I put this in this document, because I did this earlier today. I didn't do it right now. Let's say, our item can have an associated item. So for some reason, I want to make sure if I have a machete in my backpack, it also has a scabbard, right? So we have associated items. I don't know why that was the first example that came to my head, but that's what we're on.
Be afraid.
So my associated item basically follows the same definition of an item. So instead of, kind of filling it out, I was just like, hey, let's just reference an item from inside of my item object, right? So this is a little bit recursive. So our reference references itself. You can't really see it too much when you first look at this example schema that is being displayed up here. But when you drill into the schema, I've got an item. Ooh, okay, my item definition has an associated item. What's that? Oh, that's an item. Okay. Ooh, this is fun, right? A lot of these things, I can see
Items all the way down.
Yeah, items all the way down. Our scabbard can have a handle, and our handle can have, leather. I don't know. I've lost the thread of this example. But things like this, again, you're not seeing any errors, but there's definitely something wrong with my contract. You really need to look through your contract, with your dunce cap on, and really think about what am I actually communicating to my consumers. Click on all the different bits in your contract, click on all the different arrows and follow them down and really fully understand what your contract is saying, because the better you can document your API, the less your consumers are actually going to call you at the end of the day to be like, hey, how do I use this? What do I do? And then the more time you have to write your code and not deal with people. And isn't that every developer's dream? Not dealing with people. That's the one. I gotta remember that one. Okay. The other thing that seems useful is there's some keywords. There's all of, there's any of, and there's one of. These are keywords that OpenAPI has that say that where you can either combine or reuse references and say hey, from this spot I can have many of these things or just one of these things, but there could be differences here. They're kind of polymorphic in a way, and you need to be really careful when you're using them. So let me pull up that example. I need hold music or something. While I'm doing all this copying. Okay. So here's an example. I made a fake API that I can get any store item based off of the ID. You can send me any ID of any object that exist in my store, and you will either get a backpack or an ID pack, right? I've seen this a couple times, right? Where, hey, you're sending me an ID of the thing that I own, and I'm going to give you back one of the things that I own. What this is actually communicating to a user is that it's totally possible for me to send you a backpack ID, and I'm going to get an item back when those objects are two completely different shapes. Or I can send you an item ID and get a backpack back. As a consumer, I don't fully know what I'm going to get back. I just have to trust my producer to produce the correct thing back to me. So this is, I know I said I wasn't going to talk too much about architecture, best practices of writing an API, but this is a spot where your API can really point out to you that you're designing something in a way that could be confusing to a user or to a consumer. So just kind of, if you're hey, one of would work great here, maybe rethink some of your life choices. And maybe redesign your API just a little bit so you're not being too confusing to your users. The other thing that I've seen a lot.
Would that be an argument for contract first?
Yes, that is a great argument for contract first development. If you're ever writing an API contract, you really should write your API contract before you write your API. But if you're in a bind, we've got tools. Try not to get in that bind though.
Question on that there. When you work with OpenAPI, is it possible to have it, so like, are there any like special developer tools, for example, in Java land, where it can kind of check like, oh, do you have like all of your endpoints defined, you know, any type of kind of maintenance checks there?
So I know that's something no name can do. So like that's a tool outside of writing your code is it's called no name. It's like a security watchdog. It can check how your API is being used and compare it to your contract definition and tell you if there are discrepancies. I know that exists. There are like websites and tools and stuff like that that will help you get started with writing your OpenAPI definition. There's also the inverse of that, where if you have an OpenAPI definition, you can use it to write your POJOs or your Go like object thingies that I totally forget what they're called. So you can generate code from your contract, which is great. Does that answer your question? Kind of, not really.
It sounds like that there's like a separate tool,
Yeah,
not really part of this space, but that it can kind of take an OpenAPI spec and you say, this is my implementation, and it can try to do some checks, but it's a little bit more niche.
It's a lot more niche. I've not yet found like a good like IDE extension that will help check it, or like good like annotations, or like.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about like at build, or as part of your pipelines, just have something to be able to kind of do that check. Because like then, like if you do like contract first development, and you go to do like a new build release.
Robert apparently has something to say.
Tools like Postman and Insomnia run on their API clients.
Yeah.
Using the OpenAPI spec to generate your collection, and then use that in your pipeline to all your code, actually will help you test what is implemented and what is not. So using tools like Postman integration and Insomnia and Postwatch or Firewatch or all the other alternatives, if you use them as an integration testing tool as well, use it as a step, and that will validate if I'm matching my contract, because all those should come back true.
Right, but if there is like an endpoint that's missing, and then you lapse on adding that integration test, then.
So the only way that endpoint can be missing is if you're generating your spec from your code, because you should be able to use your spec to hit on the endpoint, you should be able to 404.
Ooh.
Nice. Oh, it'll automatically.
Like if you import an OpenAPI spec in Postman and generate the
I see.
it generates everything you
Okay,
described.
gotcha.
You can call the server, you'll get a 404 if something's not in.
Okay, cool. That's a good point. Thank
Okay,
you.
cool. So Postman and Insomnia can help. You can put your contracts into them and then run integration tests versus your contract versus your code and make sure everything is all hunky-dory and playing well together. That's great. Okay, so Olive is something that I've seen a lot of misuse of, I would say. Developers think that it'd be really cool. So like, let's say that for my like backpacks and my items, I want to keep track of some audit fields. Like I want to know who's creating them, who's updating them, and when my backpack, if my backpack is ever deleted or my item's ever deleted, I want to know when it was deleted. Sounds great in theory, right? I'm gonna need these fields on any time I need an item or a backpack, anytime I'm working with any of those objects. So every time I'm gonna reference my item, I'm also gonna reference my audit fields. And I'm gonna say all of these things together will combine into one, let their power, what is Captain Planet, right? With my powers combined, we will be the object that you return. Cool. Okay, great. On the same page, it seems reasonable, right? The problem with that is that I did not. What? What's that? I thought I did that. Okay. The problem with that is that I can create on my post requests. I'm getting a deleted at field back, which means can I create something that's already been deleted? If I'm doing that, why? What really is happening? So this goes back to kind of like where we talked about not being dry. So in this specific instance, I would want not to have all my audit fields together. I would want to have my deleted at least separately, so I'm including deleted where it makes sense to be able to return something that's been deleted, not on any old thing that's returning a backpack or an item. Really use your fields where they make sense. And also, like, if you're, like, all of it is just tricky. If you write your own API linter like I have before, all of it's just tricky to parse down and really figure out. All of it gets really squirrely, and it's also really hard to say olive without thinking about the food olives. And if you're like me and you don't really like olives, it's kind of like, it gives you, like, you don't really want to do that. So our last kind of pitfall we're going to talk about, which I don't really have a good example for, but OpenAPI has the ability to, when you're doing your references, you can actually reference a URL, right? So this sounds really, really great, right? Let's say we're working with complicated data sets. Let's say we're a grocery store, and we keep track of product or item information, and there's like 50 fields related to a product or an item at my grocery store. And I don't want to have every single team write a product definition in their OpenAPI catalog if they need a product definition. Like, one team should own that. Everyone should return the same product definition. Let me define my product definition in one file that teams can then reference the file using this HTTP route. It sounds really cool to do. It sounds really great, right? One team has to write it, everybody else can just pull it. The problem that I've seen with it is in corporate structures, a lot of our APIs and a lot of our contracts are behind security. And there's no way for these OpenAPI documents to like actually get the data, like actually send in the request to get that product object without sending in any security. If you're doing that, you're exposing your data to like the whole world. I mean, you probably would have legal knocking on your door being like, hey, let's not do that. Like, let's pretend this never happened, and let's escort you out the building and take away all your access, and too bad, so sad, it was great working with you. Bye. But it does seem really cool, and I really do hope that, like, as OpenAPI evolves, as SmartFair evolves, they figure out a way to allow you to send in some sort of like security information on these references, these URL references, so you can actually get documents from secure servers. But it's one of those things. There's a lot of things. There's a lot more things than just these that sound really cool at the start, and when you think about them, like, they sound really cool and they sound like a really useful feature, but in practice they end up not working very well. And it's hard to tell that they're not working very well until you try to host your document somewhere and all of a sudden your document breaks and you don't understand why. And then you put it in your Swagger editor and you're just like, well, every Swagger editor says I'm fine, so like, what's wrong with me? There's a lot more than HTTP routes and things like that. Then, like I said at the start of this talk, that like OpenAPI is a beast. It needs to be, or I believe that it should be classified as a specific skill set, as a specific language, because it's not something that you're going to pick up and really fully understand in 20 minutes. It takes years, it takes a lot of examples, it takes a lot of knowledge to really fully understand how to use OpenAPI correctly and effectively to communicate to your consumers so that we can be lazy devs and not have to tell it to people. I think that's really all that I have prepared. I'd love feedback of things that, if anybody's still confused on anything, if there's anything else about OpenAPI I can still talk about, if there's any other questions, love to hear it. Otherwise, we can go back to mingling and maybe there's some pizza left over, not sure. Heckler?
I do want to kind of try to, let's see if there's any questions that specific to your talk that anybody else has. But if not, I would love to kind of get into the, does this change at all in the agentic world when, agents and MCP servers exist, and, does this still hold true in that space or not? I don't have the answers to that, and I don't know that anyone does, but could be an interesting conversation. I
Can you tell that Hector and I talked about this before this talk happened, so I knew he was gonna say something about it, so I put that in the talk, so I could make a joke about how he's not with class anymore. Cool. Yes.
Yeah, any lessons learned, and maybe others can chime in on actually trying to do the contract first before the code's ready? Or we're like, I wish I had done it better.
One of the biggest lessons learned that I personally experienced was don't just write the contract yourself and then say that you're done with it. Like, make sure you get a front end dev to review it, make sure you get another back end dev to review it, and make sure you get your QA to review it. Because the combination of those three people, they're gonna put on the caps that, because you know what you're trying to write in your OpenAPI contracts. And and having multiple different people review it, especially people in multiple different roles. So your backend dev is gonna review it from the perspective of, okay, I'm gonna write this contract, I'm gonna write the code that implements this contract, so what do I need to know? Your front end dev is gonna go, hey, I'm going to need to use this contract to call these APIs, and so what do I need to know? And then your QA is just gonna be super thorough, especially if you have a really good QA. My favorite, I love QAs. I love them. They prevent me from releasing bugs to production, right? They're gonna point all the things where hey, I forgot to make sure my examples are meaningful, or hey, this description doesn't quite make sense to me. What can we add to the description to make it make sense? So my biggest lesson learned was get multiple different roles, multiple different eyes on your contracts before you publish them.
It's a classic shift left optimization, right? I mean, in a lean by stream, find it earlier find your bugs essentially in your contract earlier in the development process saves money, time, effort.
Yeah. I think the first time I tried to write a contract first, I got to Leanne, sitting over there, hi Leanne, sorry for calling you out. And Leanne immediately asked me 5 different questions, and I immediately realized I needed to change my contract and re-implement my code because it just wasn't working the way it needed to work. So, shift left, have multiple people review it.
On a current project, we saved 4 or 5 refactors just by designing first. Not even go to full spec, just here's a JSON payload. Does this make sense? And we went through several iterations over a week, and we would have refactored 4 or 5 times easily, saving taking us months to do the work instead of days. So even if you only do the JSON for it, not even the full API spec, do that first every time. You will save refactors.
Your suggestion to not let the code write the contract, does that apply to typed languages and non-typed languages? Or?
Probably, I don't really work in a lot of non-typed languages, so I don't fully know if there's any pitfalls for me saying, yeah, you should not let the contract write the code for both. But at the end of the day, the thing that matters is, are you clearly communicating how your API is working? That's end all, be all, that's the #1 question you need to answer. So if that works out for typed and non-typed languages, great. If not, then I'll need to learn more.
So to sort of address that, and to reference one of your inside jokes, back in the days with SOAP, you could define this web service document.
The WSDL.
The WSDL.
Yeah.
And some Java frameworks would, as you write your code and construct your code, it would generate a WSDL from the server. So the server would do introspection and create that. We had a case where there was a hand-rolled WSDL and a generated WSDL, and you had to know which one to request in your client, or else the application would either work or not. So that's a...
The other fun thing with that is I worked on a project for 13 years. We had a misspelling in the WSDL that was auto-generated that no one realized until someone new came on going, that's misspelled. I'm like, that's been there for 13 years. But it was all code generated, and we abbreviated the code, and we contracts first, get them reviewed, and stop that problem.
Do you guys want to hear the backpack soap inside story?
Yes.
So there's an architect at Kroger. His name is Mark Stiver. He's a great guy. Some of you know him. Probably like 4 of you know him. He once wrote a book about the SOAP protocols, which is what I linked to here. He is very embarrassed by this fact. He does not appreciate the fact that we know this. So I want to bring it up as often as possible.
That's the coolest thing I learned in it, by the way.
You're welcome. Please tell Mark next time you see him. The other piece of this story is that at one point in Kroger, our monitoring team had a contest where at the end of the contest you could win a backpack. I very rightfully won said backpack, but Mark Stiver disagrees with my rightful winning, and he believes he should have won that even though he fully copied my answer. So that's been an inside joke between me and Stiver since like 2018, 2019, somewhere around in there. So I recently left Kroger, and one of the last things that I did was give Mark Stiver a backpack full of soap. It was like Dial, like hand soap, like dishwashing soap. Like I was laughing hysterically the entire time. It was great. But anyway, that's my soap inside joke. Anyway, thank you. Any other questions for me, or should we let Heckler start asking ChatGPT about agentic APIs?
We don't have to talk about that. I just thought it might be interesting. The one thought I thought is, when machines are consuming your OpenAPI spec, how important is the documentation pieces? But watching her go through this and putting things like examples of how you want something to look like, that's exactly what LLMs learn from, right? Patterns and examples. So I'm guessing, I don't know this because I haven't had hands on a keyboard for quite some time, but that has to be helpful, I would think, to helping whatever agent that's consuming this understand it better than it otherwise would. So, and again, LLMs are allowing us to talk to computers, literally, verbally talk, right? It's changing the interface, to computers significantly. And so descriptions and other things that we can verbally articulate in the file will be useful. That's my thought. I have no idea if that's true or not.
So can you write a description in a way that's like cool for humans, but fucks with the AIs?
Yes. Oh, that'd be great. Let's do that.
Do invisible characters on and project data where it's actually fun. You can also do it. But if it's actually legit, like only the LLMs picked up, that would screw it up, and we can spit out the secrets. It's a lot of fun. And worst case scenario, you spend Sam Altman's money, that's fine by me. I think everyone should spend his money saying please and thank you.
I read a paper recently, there was a paper that only takes about 250 documents and it can be jacked.
So
It's really, even if the